There is a moment, if you have ever eaten alone and without a screen in front of you, where something strange happens. The food tastes different. Not better in any dramatic sense, not worse. Just different. More present somehow. More real. And then, almost immediately, the mind starts to wonder why that happened, and whether it happens every time, and whether you have simply been missing it. That moment is what this video is about, not the diet advice, not the tips for mindful eating that you have seen in 100 listicles. This is about what is actually happening underneath that experience. The biology, the neurology, the sensory mechanics of slowing down around food. Because once you understand the mechanism, the experience changes. And once the experience changes, it tends to stay changed. So let us start with something you already know from your own body. When you eat quickly, there is a particular quality to the experience. It is efficient, yes, it gets the job done. But there is also something slightly hollow about it. You finish, and there is a brief pause where the brain catches up, and sometimes the thought arrives that you barely remember eating that. The plate is empty, the food is gone, and the experience of it has already started to dissolve, like a dream you are trying to hold on to a few minutes after waking. Now compare that to a meal where, for whatever reason, things slowed down. Maybe you were in good company and the conversation stretched time out. Maybe you were somewhere beautiful and the surroundings demanded attention. Maybe you were just very hungry and the first few bites were so satisfying that you did not want to rush past them. In those moments, eating is an entirely different category of experience. And the interesting question is not just why that feels better, but what is biologically and neurologically different about those two modes? Let us start with the mouth, because that is where everything begins, and it is also where most fast eating fails to show up at all. When you chew slowly and thoroughly, something the body was designed to do, you are doing several things at once. You are mechanically breaking down food particles into smaller units, which increases the surface area available for digestive enzymes to work on. You are mixing food with saliva, which contains amylase, an enzyme that begins the digestion of starches before the food even reaches the stomach. And you are activating a dense network of sensory receptors in the mouth that are responsible for something called flavor release. These receptors respond to temperature, texture, pressure, and chemical compounds. When you chew slowly, you allow more time for volatile aromatic compounds to travel up through the back of the throat into the olfactory system. And because roughly 80 to 90% of what we experience as taste is actually smell, this is not a minor detail. It is most of the experience. Fast eating, in a very literal sense, skips the experience of the food. You are swallowing things before the flavor has had time to fully develop. You are bypassing the sensory phase that the body designed for a reason. And the result is not just a less rich experience in the moment. It is a set of signals that never properly arrive downstream. Which brings us to the stomach, and one of the most important feedback loops in the body that most people never think about. There is a hormone called cholecystokinin. It is released from the small intestine in response to fat and protein, and it sends a signal to the brain that says something like, "We are getting what we need. Things are going well down here." There is also leptin, released from fat cells, which is part of a longer-term satiety signal. And there is a hormone called ghrelin, which is sometimes called the hunger hormone, that works in the opposite direction. Ghrelin levels drop as you eat, contributing to the sensation of fullness, but all of these hormonal signals take time to travel. The general estimate from research is that it takes somewhere around 15 to 20 minutes from the start of eating for the brain to begin receiving meaningful satiety signals. If you eat a full meal in 7 minutes, and many people eat faster than that, you have swallowed everything before the feedback loop has had a chance to run even a single complete cycle. You are operating blind, metabolically speaking. You have consumed the entire input before the system has had a chance to respond. And then, several minutes later, you feel full, often uncomfortably so. This is not a personal failing. It is a timing mismatch between modern eating habits and a feedback system that was calibrated for a different pace of life. A pace that involved, among other things, a lot more chewing. Now, here is where it gets more interesting, because this is not just about digestion. The pace of eating is connected to the autonomic nervous system in ways that have real consequences for stress and for how the body processes everything happening around a meal. The autonomic nervous system has two primary modes. There is the sympathetic branch, which governs the fight or flight response. It accelerates the heart, sharpens certain kinds of attention, and redirects energy and blood flow toward the muscles and away from the digestive system. And there is the parasympathetic branch, sometimes called the rest and digest system, which does roughly the opposite. It slows the heart rate, activates digestive processes, and creates the physiological conditions for proper absorption and processing of food. Here is the important part. The state you are in when you eat shapes how your body handles the meal. When you eat quickly, particularly at a desk, while driving, while scrolling through something on your phone, while feeling the low-level pressure of the afternoon collapsing into evening and tasks still undone, you are often eating in a sympathetic state, a mild stress state. And in that state, digestion is quite literally deprioritized by the body. Blood flow to the digestive organs is reduced, enzyme secretion is altered. The entire machinery of digestion is turned down because the body, at some level, believes this is not the moment for a leisurely process of nutrient extraction. This is a moment for action. The food arrives, and the system is not fully ready for it. Eating slowly, on the other hand, tends to accompany or induce a parasympathetic state. It is not just that calm people eat slowly. It is also that the act of slowing down the eating process can itself shift the nervous system toward parasympathetic activity. There is evidence that the mechanical act of chewing, repeated slow rhythmic movement of the jaw, has a mild regulatory effect on arousal and stress response. Some research has explored the connection between chewing and cortisol, the primary stress hormone, with findings suggesting that sustained chewing can reduce cortisol levels in certain conditions. This means that slow eating is not just a better delivery mechanism for the food, it is a form of physiological regulation. The meal itself, eaten slowly, becomes a kind of practice for the nervous system. And this is where the idea of tempo becomes genuinely fascinating. Tempo is something we tend to associate with music, or with sports, or with the rhythm of conversation. But everything has a tempo. Work has a tempo. Sleep has a tempo, and eating has a tempo. The interesting thing about humans in modern environments is that the default tempo for almost everything has accelerated dramatically over the last several decades, and eating has accelerated along with it, often without anyone choosing that acceleration consciously. Think about the environments that eating now takes place in. The lunch break that is not quite long enough to feel restful. The meal at the desk because there is a deadline pressing down. The dinner eaten in front of a screen because the day was exhausting and the screen is just there. In each of these contexts, the eating is not allowed its own tempo. It is subordinated to another tempo, usually a faster one. And the food becomes secondary, a background task, something the body handles while the real attention goes elsewhere. The body handles it poorly under those conditions. Not catastrophically, not every time, but not well either. And here is the psychological layer, because the body and mind are not separate systems, even though we tend to talk about them as if they are. Attention is a resource. This is not a metaphor. Cognitive science has demonstrated in quite granular detail that there are limits to human attention, and that the allocation of that attention affects perception, memory, and experience at every level. When you are eating while doing something else, you're not fully eating. You are dividing a finite attentional resource across two streams of input, and both streams receive less than they would if they had the full allocation. One consequence of this divided attention during eating is something that has been studied under the heading of mindless eating, a term coined by researcher Brian Wansink and explored extensively in the literature on food behavior. The basic finding is that when attentional resources are directed away from eating, the regulatory processes that govern how much we eat and how satisfied we feel are impaired. People eat more, they enjoy it less, they feel less full afterward, and they return to eating sooner. The mechanism is not fully mysterious. Satiety is not purely chemical. It is also cognitive. The brain needs to register the experience of eating in order to update its internal model of nutritional state. If the experience of eating is not fully processed because attention was elsewhere, the update is incomplete. The body has received the food, but the mind has not fully registered the meal. And hunger, or something that resembles hunger, can persist even when calories have already arrived. Eating slowly is, in part, a solution to this attentional problem. When you slow down, you create the conditions for full registration. The experience of each bite gets processed rather than skipped. The meal enters memory as a real event, not as a blur, and the satiety signals, both chemical and cognitive, have time to develop properly. There is something worth sitting with here, because it points towards something larger than just eating. We live in a culture that has a complex and somewhat troubled relationship with slowness. Speed is associated with competence, with ambition, with relevance. Slowness is often treated with a kind of mild suspicion, as if it might be a symptom of not caring enough, or not being engaged enough, or falling behind in some competition that never quite gets named. This cultural bias towards speed is so pervasive that it operates largely invisibly. Most people have never consciously decided to eat quickly. They have simply absorbed the tempo of their environment, and that tempo happens to be fast. But there are costs to this that accumulate quietly. The research on fast eating and metabolic health is fairly consistent. People who eat more quickly tend to have higher body weights, higher rates of metabolic syndrome, higher rates of insulin resistance. The association holds across many studies and many populations. It is not a small effect. And while correlation is not causation, the proposed mechanisms are plausible and well supported. The hormonal timing mismatch, the impaired digestive function under sympathetic dominance, the attentional dysregulation of satiety. These are not speculative connections. They are things the body is actually doing, and they are sensitive to pace. But the costs are not only metabolic, and this is the part that tends to get left out of the conversation about eating speed, probably because it is harder to measure. When you eat quickly and distractedly for long enough, something shifts in your relationship with food. Food becomes primarily functional. It is fuel. It is a problem to be solved between other problems. It is something the body demands and the schedule reluctantly accommodates. The sensory pleasure of eating, which is a genuine and legitimate pleasure, not an indulgence or a distraction from more serious things, fades from the picture. Not because the pleasure is no longer there, but because the conditions for experiencing it have been removed. The flavor is still in the food. The texture is still there. The warmth, the aroma, the way a well-made piece of bread resists slightly before giving way. All of that is still happening. But if attention is elsewhere, if the pace is too fast for the sensory system to fully engage, the experience does not reach consciousness with any richness. It arrives compressed and flat, the way a song sounds when you hear it through a wall. Something is getting through, but not the thing that makes it worth hearing. Slowing down at a sensory level is a form of amplification. Not amplification in the sense of making things louder or more intense. Amplification in the sense of allowing the signal to arrive fully. The food does not change. Your nervous system's access to the food does. Now let us talk about what it actually means to eat slowly, not as a rule or a prescription, but as a practice that the body can learn over time. There is a common misunderstanding about slow eating, which is that it requires willpower, that it is a discipline imposed on a body that naturally wants to rush, and there is something true in that. In the beginning, when habits are being formed, but the deeper experience of people who have actually shifted their eating pace is that it fairly quickly stops feeling like discipline and starts feeling like preference. Once the nervous system gets used to the experience of a slower meal, the sensory richness that becomes available, the actual satisfaction that arrives when satiety signals have time to run their course, the alternative begins to feel like the deprivation. You stop rushing not because you are forcing yourself to stop, but because the slower version is simply better, and better in a way that is concrete and felt, not in a vague wellness language kind of way. The food tastes more. You feel more satisfied when you finish. You are less likely to look for something else 10 minutes later. Your body handles the meal more smoothly. Your afternoon is better. The change, when it happens, is not about eating slowly in the sense of performing slowness. It is about giving the eating enough space to be an actual experience rather than a background process. And this connects to something that sits at the heart of why slowness matters in a broader sense. There is a concept in psychology and neuroscience that sometimes gets called presence, though that word has been somewhat overused. What it is actually pointing at is the degree to which the brain is processing present moment sensory input versus running predictions, memories, plans, and narratives in the foreground. When the mind is heavily loaded with other content, when it is planning, worrying, reviewing, anticipating, the sensory experience of the present moment gets less bandwidth. Things happen that the brain barely registers, and time subjectively compresses and passes without much texture. Eating slowly is one of the simplest available ways to reverse this, at least temporarily. Not because slow eating is a spiritual practice, though some traditions treat it as one, but because it is a sensory demand that the body is well equipped to meet, if given the opportunity. The food is interesting. The flavors are genuinely complex. The experience of eating, when fully attended to, is not boring or empty. It is actually quite absorbing. It pulls attention out of the planning layer and into the sensory layer. And in doing so, it offers a kind of rest that the planning layer rarely gives itself. This is why people who eat slowly often describe feeling less stressed after meals, not just less full, less stressed. The meal did something for the nervous system beyond delivering nutrition. It provided a window of sensory engagement that temporarily displaced the cognitive load. A small rest embedded in the middle of the day. This is not an accident. This is what meals were for most of human history. They were interruptions in the flow of effort. They were occasions that structured the day around something other than production. They were times when the pace of the world was allowed to slow down because the body had a different kind of claim on the present moment. We have largely stopped treating them that way. And the effects of that change show up in metabolic data, in attentional research, in the quiet and persistent feeling that something is missing from the experience of eating even when the food is objectively fine. What is missing is not a better recipe or a more interesting ingredient. What is missing is time, not a great deal of time. Research on eating pace suggests that meaningful differences in satiety and digestive function begin to appear with relatively modest changes in speed. Adding 5 or 10 minutes to a meal that might otherwise take 7 minutes is not a significant imposition on the day, but it is enough to let the feedback loop run, enough to let the flavors develop, enough for the parasympathetic system to engage, enough for attention to land on the food rather than somewhere else. 5 to 10 minutes, that is the gap between eating that the body can work with and eating that the body is struggling to keep up with. And here is a thought to end on. Not a directive, not a call to action, just something worth carrying forward. Every meal you eat is a temporary reduction in the complexity of the world. The world keeps going at its speed. The news keeps arriving. The tasks keep accumulating. but for the duration of a meal, if you allow it. The only thing that is actually required of you is to eat. The only thing the moment is asking for is attention to what is in front of you. And what is in front of you, in most cases, is something that someone grew and transported and prepared, and that your body is about to transform into energy and structure and thought. That is not a trivial chain of events. It is actually quite remarkable when you let it be. Eating slowly does not make you healthier because slowness is virtuous. It makes you healthier because it aligns the pace of your behavior with the pace of the body's own processes. The body is not slow because it is primitive or inefficient. It is slow because real things take time. Digestion takes time. Satiety takes time. Flavor takes time. And when you match your pace to the pace of those processes, they work. They work properly, and you feel the difference. You also get something harder to name but no less real. You get the experience of the meal itself, not a memory of having eaten, not the knowledge that you consumed something. The actual experience, with all its texture and warmth and flavor and the particular quality of attention that comes from being, even briefly, fully present to what is happening right now. That experience is available at every meal. It has always been there. It just requires a little space to arrive.